We are not going to review much tonight. We've got way too much to cover, and I want to stay on schedule, so we'll have 4 lessons at the end of this to spend on some things about the Bible we need to know will help in our study. So again, we're looking for a solid foundation for our faith, a firm foundation for biblical understanding. Early on, we looked at the science of textual criticism and found out that because of how it works, we can know we have the Bible as it was originally written. And so the foundation for our whole thing is that the Bible we have is the Bible as it was originally. And unless we have that, we don't have anything. But we do. We can count on that. We have a text we can trust. To that foundation, we added that we have clearly identified eyewitnesses and their companions who wrote the New Testament. And there's just way too much writings of others at the time. And remember, we went through a whole lot of things that we could determine that. We added one more layer to our foundation, and that is the eyewitnesses are totally believable. And we said martyrdom was the guarantee of honesty. Now, what we're looking at, though, is if God is going to come into mankind's world, someone has to come from God to tell us about God. Otherwise, you're just guessing. And that, of course, was Jesus. And then last week, we turned a corner from information about the Gospels and their trustworthiness to information in the Gospels. And remember, we determined we have, again, this is review, a text we can trust, eyewitness testimony, and a record we can believe. Those are so foundational that you just got to remember those, folks. That's all in our foundation. And then on it, we saw how Jesus' life is told in the New Testament. It's not like myth or legend. And so we have a pillar on our little building of Jesus' life. We also looked at his teaching. Summarized, like nearly everybody says Jesus is the best teacher ever lived, but it went a whole lot more than that. But we just won't review that anymore tonight. Jesus' teaching, authoritative, different, claimed to come from God, all that. So, God comes into mankind's world, and when he does, it needs to be more than just different or authoritative. It must be supernatural. And we require supernatural credentials for anyone who claims to speak from God. That is the key. And that's what we looked at last time, that Jesus did present supernatural credentials. And so we talked about a lot of miracles. Nicodemus gets a bad rap, you know it? Came to Jesus at night. We don't know whether he accepted very much what Jesus said, although he shows up later in council meetings of the Sanhedrin defending Jesus, at least slightly. But one thing, when he came to Jesus, he says, "We know you're a teacher come from God. No one could perform the miracles you do unless you were." And that is to his credit. Nicodemus understood, and so should we. So, in addition, we set another pillar last week, miracles. That's where we get into the supernatural. Jesus had miraculous credentials. So we have his life, his teachings, and his miracles as 3 pillars in this little structure we're using to show how it must follow. One thing has to rest on something else, okay? We can't just scattergun this whole thing. When someone claims to speak for God, we expect supernatural credentials, something to prove divine authority. Next, fulfilled prophecy. And that's where we are tonight. Now, when you're talking about prophecy, what do you look for? Now, remember, we've already determined we can trust what the New Testament says happened. That's a given. But real prediction of future is not the kind of thing based on physical processes or natural patterns. It's definitely miraculous, impossible without supernatural involvement. Predicting the outcome of scientific experiments or the weather does not count as prophecy. It just doesn't. Well, what do we look for? Did the prophet really make the prediction long before the fulfillment? Okay? Was he truly looking into his future and seeing something that would happen later? Not next week, but hundreds of years later. Is the event predicted in our past? So we can check it out by the usual methods of historical research. Was the prediction clear enough? There can be no doubt about the fulfillment. No vague generalities or ambiguities allowed. And what is the chance of such predictions being nothing more than coincidence or lucky guess on the part of the prophet? Prophecy must be miraculous. So what do we here? Look at it this way. There's a prophet. There were a bunch of them. From 1500 BC with Moses to 400 BC with Malachi. He predicts something, looks forward to it. Comes true in Jesus somewhere between 5 BC and 35 AD, allowing a little slack a few years either side of his life. Then a gospel writer writes it, and it comes to us. That's the way prophecy works. Again, this is what I said before. It has to be real prediction of the future to be supernatural. So the question is, what do our witnesses, remember, reliable eyewitness witnesses, eyewitness writers of the Gospels, was anything clearly predicted ahead of time which came true in the life of Jesus? Some people have counted more than 300 Old Testament prophecies or predictions that were fulfilled by Jesus. But admittedly, some of those are somewhat vague. The very first one, Genesis 3, God's talking to Adam and Eve and the devil after the sin. Says to the devil, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, you will strike his heel. That's why women hate snakes, right? Maybe. But that was predicted by God, fulfilled in Jesus, because God says it's the seed of the woman, and we know of Jesus' virgin birth. But you don't use that one to try to convince an unbeliever, okay? It's a little vague. There are a lot of the others that are, but there's some that are not vague at all. Was anything clear enough? Yes. A ruler's birth in Bethlehem was predicted 700 years ahead of time. Someone very special was coming, whose origins are of old. Probably at Christmas time you've heard this one read several times. Micah says, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come one for me who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. 700 BC, Micah. And you probably then went on to read this one at Christmas time. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole world should be taxed, if you're familiar with the old King James one. So Joseph went up from Nazareth in Galilee. Where? Bethlehem. You just heard that somewhere else, didn't we? Micah said Bethlehem. Now, how did Micah know where the king was going to be born? Fulfilled in Jesus. The Jewish leaders knew where the king was going to be born. Do you know that? Remember when the Magi, traditionally wise men, came looking for the baby king, and they stopped in Jerusalem to ask. They would go, king be born, we'll go to the palace, ask where the king's going to be born. Of course, upset Herod something fierce. But he called in the religious leaders and says, what are these guys talking about? And they quoted Micah. They knew. They believed it. They just didn't believe Jesus. The special someone would have a forerunner. Malachi, 2 places says, I will send my messenger. And then he says, I will send the prophet Elijah. And if you read Jesus talking about John the Baptist, he says, he was the Elijah who is to come. Somebody who tells you Elijah has to come before Jesus can return does not know the Gospels well. I used to get letters, weird letters, especially when I was preaching up by Chicago, from people who claimed to be certain one guy claimed to be the Elijah that was to come. I used to have a whole file about 3/8 of an inch thick in my files. I finally threw it away when we moved down here. Anyhow, predicted by Malachi, 400 BC. Also foretold by Isaiah. One in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord. John quotes that one. Isaiah was 700 BC. John came preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This is the one, Matthew says, who's spoken of through the prophet Isaiah. A time was coming, the Old Testament prophet said, when the blind would see, the deaf would hear, the lame would jump, and the voiceless would shout. There's some of us here tonight that wish the Lord were still here to help our ears and our eyes. We were having a little discussion about that over supper with 2 or 3 of us up here. Isaiah, 700 plus BC, says the eyes of the blind will be opened, ears of the deaf unstopped, lame will leap like a deer. Fulfilled in Jesus' miracles. We talked about a bunch of those last week. What about the incident called the triumphal entry? Jesus comes riding in to Jerusalem on a donkey colt. Zechariah, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. 500 years earlier. We can read the story. Jesus sent 2 disciples saying, go to the village, untie the colt, bring it back, and tell the owner the Lord needs him. You're probably familiar with that one. And so they did. And the people, it's all fulfilled in great detail in what we call Palm Sunday. One of my favorites, and one that very few people know anything about or talk about. The prophet Zechariah in chapter 11 is talking about he's been hired to be shepherd of the people. And they don't want him to be their shepherd. He goes to the leader and says, okay, you know what, I won't, but pay me my pay. So they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the guy who makes pots, the handsome price at which they priced me. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar enough to know, and they didn't have such things as quotation marks. I'm wondering if the quotation mark should go where that yellow circle is, after the me, where God is telling Zechariah the handsome price at which they priced me. That is God. Rather than the Lord says, Zechariah, throw it to the potter, and Zechariah saying the handsome price at which they priced me, Zechariah. So he says, I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. What? 500 BC. Who else was priced for 30 pieces of silver? Jesus. That's what the priest paid Judas to betray Jesus. Was there a potter in the temple? Not that I could find any record of. There were people who sold sacrificial animals, money changers, but not a potter. Look what happened. Judas, after he had betrayed Jesus, saw Jesus was condemned, seized with guilt, tries to take the 30 pieces of silver back to the priests. And we don't want it. You deal with it. So he threw it into the temple. And the high priest says, it's against the law to put this in the treasury, so it's blood money. Where does that money end up? They bought a field from a potter, place where a potter dug the clay for his pots, to use to bury paupers and foreigners. Were Zechariah's actions a direct prediction of Judas? I think so. There are two major predictions of Jesus' death. One is in Psalm 22, written about 1000 BC by David. The other was in Isaiah 53, written about 700 BC. I want us to look at those with some detail. These are interesting. Everybody remembers the 23rd Psalm. What's the 23rd Psalm? Lord? Okay. What's the 22nd Psalm? It begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? The very words of Jesus on the cross are the first verse of the 22nd Psalm. And if you forget which Psalm that is, I'll come back and haunt you. We know the 23rd, but we don't know the 22nd. I won't read all of this. We get down to verse 8. Now, if you go to the New Testament and read the Gospels, the crucifixion of Jesus, I think it's most of this, more in Matthew than any other, and I didn't look to trigger my old memory. But when the priests and leaders of the Jewish people were mocking Jesus while he was on the cross, what did they say? They said, he trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. I don't think they were intentionally quoting the 22nd Psalm. They were taunting Jesus they thought was a blasphemous, worthy of death criminal. But it's there. Get to verse 14. I am poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint. When they hung somebody on the cross, the position itself tore shoulders out of joint, everything. And they twisted the legs to drive the nail sideways through both heels. Nothing else that we know of does that but crucifixion. What was one of the things Jesus cried out during his time on the cross? I thirst. It says, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. Verse 16, they have pierced my hands and my feet. Did you know this is the only place in Scripture that it mentions piercing his feet? Yet we showed you a lesson or two back, an archaeological find of nail struck through the heel bones and Achilles tendons. Evidence of crucifixion pierced through the feet. Divide my garments among them. They did that. Now, David wrote this 1,000 years before Jesus, with the Spirit of God within him, I think, dictating it to Jesus. And I think David said, God, what's this all about? Peter says one place, the prophets of old inquired about what the Spirit was telling them, and God basically told them, hey, you'll have to wait. It's not for you, it's for somebody in future days. Isaiah 53. You remember that, chapter 2, okay? Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men. John says in John 1, he came to his own did not receive him. He was pierced for our transgressions, nailed to the cross. Crushed for our iniquities. That's a Hebrew word, can be translated several ways. This happened to be NIV. The scourging. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He willing to answer Pilate, but when they sent him to Herod, he didn't say a word. Herod finally sent him back to Pilate and said, I can't do anything with him. He won't answer me. Verse 8, cut off from the land of the living. That must mean killed. Was assigned a grave with the wicked. He was killed as a criminal, 2 others with him. Where was he buried? In a brand new tomb of a rich man. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, cause him to suffer, make his life a guilt offering. When the Jews brought guilt offerings, what happened to those offerings? They were killed. Drained of the blood, burned on the altar. Now some offerings, some portions of them, were taken by the priest to eat, and worshipers would eat portions of the sacrifice, but not guilt offerings. Jesus was killed as a guilt offering. This one, after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life. What's that mean? After he's dead, he's alive again. And then I will give him a portion among the great. And Jesus has had greater impact than any other man who ever lived. Now I call him a man because he lived as a man. And we've ignored completely all the wonderful spiritual blessings that are in that chapter, such as, surely he took our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. The punishment that brought us peace is on him. By his wounds we are healed. I've heard people misuse that verse and say that Jesus' crucifixion heals us physically. I don't think that's what Isaiah is talking about. I think that's what God meant. Now, most translations translate this verse, by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many. I personally think it should be by the knowledge of him. Why? It isn't Jesus' knowledge that saves us. It's when we know him that we are justified. He bore the sin of many, made intercession for the transgressors. All that's in Isaiah 53. This is a hill just outside of Jerusalem called Gordon's Calvary. An explorer named Gordon, don't remember his first name, found that hill, thought it looked like a skull, and remember they took Jesus out to Golgotha, called the place of the skull, to crucify him. Now, it's very likely that Jesus was crucified in another place over which a medieval church was built, so we don't know the real place. But that's as good as any. That's a place called Skull Hill. That is down by the Dead Sea. See, this is the ruins from the Qumran community, or the Essenes, that were likely the ones who copied and hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember the other night when we showed you Dead Sea Caves? They're this funny-looking set of ridges around the corner of the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were in some of those caves. And there is a picture of the Isaiah scroll. You know what blows my mind? When Jesus was hanging on the cross, not more than 20 miles away, that scroll, not a copy made from that scroll was either in that Qumran library or already hidden in those caves when Jesus was hanging on the cross 20 miles away. And it says he's pierced for our iniquities. Somebody asked one session a couple of times back when we were talking archaeology what my favorite archaeological find is. It's it right there, and that's why. If there is a true prediction of Jesus' death and resurrection, these two things were existing in the world at the same time, not 25 miles apart. Well, how many details have we seen that were predicted came true in Jesus? Well, miscellaneous prophets, his birthplace, his forerunner, his healing miracles, the triumphal entry, betrayal price, happened to the money, details in Psalm 22, Jesus' words from the cross, the taunts of his enemies, pierced his hands and feet, his bones out of joint, thirst, soldiers gambling for his clothes, Isaiah, despised and rejected, pierced, nails, thorns, spear, crushed and bruised, silent before his accusers, a guilt offering, died with criminals, assigned to grave with the wicked, buried in a rich man's tomb, the resurrection, his ultimate greatness and influence. And there are dozens more. But those are among the clearest. And the easiest to remember where to find them. You basically got two chapters, Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. Do you think all of those could have come true by chance? The prophet was just guessing, got lucky? What's the chance of that? Not counting the vague prediction in Genesis 3, we've cited 21 predictions. I think the handout I gave you has 60. Like I said, some people count 300. What's the mathematical possibility, the chance ratio of those as being lucky guesses? Well, the highest probability would be 1 in 2. Let's say the Tennessee Volunteers are going to play the Indiana Hoosiers in basketball next week. The Hoosiers aren't doing nearly as well in basketball as they did in football this year, which is a turnaround us Indiana folks can hardly believe. Anyway, what's the chance of either one winning? 1 in 2. You either win or you don't. That's how you figure probabilities, 1 in 2. In these cases, the prophet's either right or wrong. Now, actual probability is less. For example, to figure the likelihood of someone special born in Bethlehem at a particular time, you would have to find out how many other little boys are born throughout Israel, Judea, and all, and then what ratio was the number is whole bunch. It might be 1 in 600 or something like that. I don't know. But the best probability, is 1 in 2, either right or wrong. Now, when you have independent predictions, you multiply them, don't add them. In the United States, 1 out of every man over 50 years old will be bald or nearly so. Got a couple of representatives of that tonight. 1 out of every 25 men will have lost a portion of a finger in some kind of an accident. Do I have any? Had a couple of, okay. Yeah, there's one. Okay, now, if we figure someone who's both bald and lost a finger, the probability is 1 in 4 times 1 in 25, so that's 1 in 100. If you consider yourself bald, you are 1 of 100. Oh, you were cheating on me. Okay, so what's the possibility of all the prophets being right in the 21 details by chance would be 1 in 2,097,152. Look at it this way. There are 2,000 dots on that page. Let's pick one, right there. It's in the 7th row down. It's 50 dots in from the right-hand side. So if we called JR in here and says, pick the right dot, if we didn't have those arrows up there, he'd have 1 chance in 2,000 of getting the right one. If we printed out 2,000 pages of those dots, and he still could leaf through all those pages, just find the one, that we'd put one little dot in the middle of it, black. That would be 1 in 2 million. And we'd still be 97,152 dots short. That's 48 3/4 pages more to equal that 1 in 2,997,152. What are the chances of anyone guessing that right? Beyond a reasonable doubt. None. None. You could win the Powerball 3 times in a row with odds like that. Now, how many details have we seen predicted that Jesus fulfilled? We've already determined we can trust the prophets. We've determined the nature of prophecy. Do you think that kind of probability could come from lucky guesses? No, not a chance. Real prophecy is definitely supernatural. So we can add fulfilled prophecy as both historic and supernatural. The last pillar is Jesus' death and resurrection. I've got about 20 minutes to summarize this, but you're familiar with this more than with the other, I think. Did Jesus really die and come back from death? New Testament obviously claims he did. Paul wrote, "What I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died according to Scriptures, was buried, was raised on the third day," and then he lists a whole bunch of Jesus' appearances. And then a little later in the chapter he says, "If it is preached that Christ has not been raised from the dead, how can you say there is no resurrection? If there's no resurrection, Christ has not been raised." And then he goes on to say, if Christ has not been raised, we have, if for this life only, we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we have nothing. Well, did he really? The New Testament obviously claims that he did. So we got three possible answers. I've taught logic some, taught it in the Bible college a couple of years, and some in other. This is what we call an exhaustive alternative, where we try to think of all of the possible things. If you guys are working on a car and it's not running right, well, it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this. If you get all of the possibilities, that is an exhaustive alternative. So you start eliminating some of them to find the problem. Well, this is an exhaustive alternative. Either the New Testament record is not historical, not true. That's one possibility. Something else happened to make Jesus' followers think he rose, but they were mistaken. Or Jesus really did come back to life after being brutally executed. That's an exhaustive alternative. Well, we've already proven the first one wrong. We know that we have an accurate record. As we can depend on that, as much as we can depend on anything that we have not personally experienced. Could something else have happened? Well, there are four possibilities put forward usually. One of them is the so-called swoon theory. That's an old-fashioned word we don't use much anymore. If a woman faints, they say she swooned, you know. Jesus didn't really die, just passed out on the cross. The spices they wrapped him in, coolness of the tomb revived him. So he came out of the tomb on the third day and everybody thought he'd risen. There's a wrong tomb theory. In their grief on Sunday morning, the women went to the wrong tomb. When they didn't find Jesus, they assumed he must have come back to life, and they saw a young man sitting by the tomb, and he says, "See where they laid him," and they thought he was pointing to the neck. There's a hallucination theory, which has probably got more traction than any of the others, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but his followers were so overcome with grief, they only thought they saw him, they were actually hallucinating. And there's the Passover plot. A fellow named Hugh Schonfield, 50, 60 years ago, wrote a book called The Passover Plot. It was also made in a movie in 76, I think, where he contended that Jesus planned and rigged the whole thing only to have it fail when the soldier stuck his spear in Jesus' side. What about those? The swoon theory, is that possible? Well, the night before his death, Jesus was under such great stress, Luke says, he sweat like great drops of blood. After being arrested in Gethsemane, he was on trial the rest of the night where the physical abuse began. Blindfolded, slapped in the face, the soldiers beat him with their fists. After unsuccessfully trying to persuade the Jews that Jesus didn't really deserve crucifixion, Pilate had him scourged, and it wasn't unusual for a man to die under that whip. How many of you saw the movie The Passion of the Christ? How many of you had to close your eyes during the scourging? I couldn't watch it. I couldn't watch it. Just couldn't. I think it was probably very realistic. They put a crown of thorns on his head, pressed into his scalp. Then they took him out and crucified him. Somebody said, "Hey, he couldn't have sweat drops of blood." Oh, yeah, he could. It's called hematohidrosis. It is possible. One of the things it does, though, it makes the skin very, very sore, and the slightest touch is excruciating pain. And do you know where we get the word excruciating? You know what that means? It means from the cross. Take the X off of it, crucified. From X, not just like exit, you go out from. Okay, excruciating means from the cross. The word the English language uses now to describe horrible pain refers to Jesus' cross. They took him out, and there they crucified him. Could Jesus have survived the cross? The slapping and beating, crown of thorns, pounding around the head, the Roman scourging, carrying the heavy cross, the nails in his hands and feet, 6 hours on the cross, intense thirst, exhaustion, bleeding, pain, final spear thrust to the heart. And you can go back and read John 19, how they came and broke the legs of the first of the two men with him. That's because when you were crucified, your weight was held on the nails in your hands, actually, right here in the heel of your hand, right in the wrist. That's where it will bear weight. If it's out here, it'll tear out. And by the nail in your feet. Well, hanging there with your weight like this, you get to suffocating. So you push up with your feet so you can get a breath. And then your feet hurt so much, it's like this for 6 hours. And then when they found Jesus wasn't dead, spear in his side, and John says the man who saw it has given testimony. He knows his testimony is true. He knows he tells the truth. He testifies that you also may believe. And there are some scholars who think that that verse was added by people who knew John when John was writing this. What do you think? Was Jesus dead when they took him down from the cross? Could Jesus have survived the cross? What happens to the human body when it's subjected to that much pain, stress, and blood loss? What's it called? Shock. What's the treatment for shock? Do you know? You keep them warm and replace fluids. They put Jesus and put him in a cool tomb, wrapped him in spices. Would that have been the right treatment for shock or made it worse? If Jesus had survived, would he have healed enough to walk out of the tomb by Sunday morning? Maybe to push that stone out of the way. What do you think? Looks to me like the swoon theory is dead.
Question.
Yes.
Not a question, but a statement. They said when they thrust the spear into his side, water and blood come out. When blood sits stagnant for a period of time, 20, 30 minutes, it separates out into the serum and the red blood cells.
Yeah.
You can't live through that.
No, it basically means the heart has ruptured, doesn't it? If they hit the heart sac, it would mean the heart is rupturing.
Yep.
That's what I've learned. And you're a
I think the
surgical
death
nurse?
rate for crucifixion was-
Pardon?
I think the death rate for crucifixion was pretty high.
Yeah, 100%. What about the wrong tomb? I don't think this wrong tomb theory is worth proposing, but there was a professor at the University of Chicago Theological Seminary named Kirsopp Lake, K-I-R-S-O-P-P, Lake, who proposed this as a legitimate possibility and published it. Would you have trouble finding the grave of a friend only a few days after you'd seen him buried? It's been 2 years since we put Sandra's ashes in that little cemetery in the woods outside of Highlands, North Carolina, and I could go right to it. You could do the same. What do you think? What about the Passover plot? Now, Passover plot, Schonfield's book made him a lot of money. Like I said, it was made into a movie. But I don't think it's worthy of serious consideration. It's just one more evidence of the anti-supernatural bias we discussed earlier. And would anyone who knew what crucifixion was like be willing to subject himself to that just on the chance that he could survive it. He said he planned it for Friday because he knew they would. Schoenfield claims he planned it for Friday because he knew they couldn't leave the bodies on the cross overnight Friday because it would be the Sabbath day, and the Jews would insist the body be taken down, so Jesus could be taken down before he died. What? Why would you put yourself through that? I mean, you've got to be some kind of megalomaniac like the world has never seen. I think Schofield's nuts, one thing, or he saw a chance to make some money. What about hallucinations? Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, then to a group of women, if that's different from the meeting with Mary. That's hard to tell for sure. He was seen by Peter alone, by James alone, though we don't have any details of that. He joined Cleopas and a companion as they walked the several miles to Emmaus. I wrote a video play about that one time, naming his companion Alexander, but I don't know. But they finally recognized him when he broke bread for their supper. Jesus appeared to all the apostles except Thomas in Jerusalem, and then later to Thomas. We talked about that last week when we had a little bit of spare time about why did Thomas not believe, the fact that his nickname was Twin. His followers left for Galilee. Jesus appeared to them, cooked their breakfast on the shore when they were fishing. While they were in Galilee, he appeared to a group on a mountaintop. That's probably, I'm going to back that up. Probably the same appearance to 500 that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15. I can just imagine when Paul wrote that down, he says, if you don't believe me, ask one of them. Could hallucinations, could a mental state conjure up that? When I did the video series for Good News Productions, I asked a medical doctor. He'd been a medical doctor in Thailand for years, and then he came home and was medical staff at the University of Nebraska. Oh, delightful, gentle, kind Christian man named Dr. Garland Baer. He happened to be in Joplin at the time. And I asked him, I said, Dr. Baer, could it have been hallucinations? He said, no. He says, people don't share hallucinations. One person may have a hallucination, but if there are others who do, it is not the same. And multiple hallucinations like this would not be possible with all we know, the way he put it, with the brain physiology we know today. And that doesn't count the grave clothes that were left behind. Story of Peter and John running to the tomb. And John runs faster because he's younger, I guess. He ducks down and looks in, and what does he see? That's what he sees. That is a post picture, of course. John forgot and left his digital camera at home. This is what they will show you outside of Jerusalem, called the Garden Tomb, which could be the tomb of Jesus. If you look closely, you can see the little trench where the stone rolled, and there was some cavity in the stone where they dug the tomb out that they filled in with stone blocks. May not be the actual tomb of Jesus, but wherever his tomb is, it's empty. And not because the disciples told about it. You know what's interesting to me? Do you know who the first people were who knew Jesus rose? The guards. The guards at the tomb. An angel came and rolled away the stone, and it said they became like dead men, but they were gone by the time the apostles and women showed up. They were gone. Where did they go? They went to tell the chief priests. And the chief priests said they had to say, tell people the disciples came by night and stole the body. Those guys were posted at that guard to prevent disciples coming and stealing the body. And the priest says, we'll keep you out of trouble. If the priest hadn't promised to keep them out of trouble, those guys could have lost their lives for allowing the exact thing to happen that they were posted there to prevent. The first people aware that Jesus was alive from the dead didn't believe in him. You got to have an open heart, folks. Now, I'm teaching you these things not because I think I convince you if you don't want to believe it. I told you I accepted this But I had a big hole in my heart from all of my belief caving in less than a year before that. That was all four of my boys studied this, learned it when they were growing up. They traveled with me when we were raising funds for the video series I did and all that. One of them's actively involved in the church today. One of them still believes, but he builds restaurants all over the Midwest and it's seldom where he can go to the same church more than a few months. One of them's traveling all over everywhere. And so he's never anywhere very long. And the youngest at Sandra's memorial services, y'all know by now I don't believe in this stuff you're saying. We can be hardened by our own emotions, by the deceitfulness of sin, by things that have happened to us, so that we turn against God no matter how much we know. My youngest son, at 16 years of age, was driving the car when it spun out on wet roads and was hit and killed his mother. And I wonder if that is why he doesn't believe. But there's anything I can do about it. He lives in Seattle. I very, very seldom talk to him, and I have to initiate it if I do. But us, I think we can say, if we can believe anything historically and not just push it away because we don't want to, that Jesus was dead and he is alive again, or not. What do you think? I got one more minute. Let me tell you a story. I may run a minute over. My father, everybody who ever knew him will say he's the smartest man they ever knew. His mother kept him back a year because he was so tiny. He didn't walk till he was 3. And he started school when he was just turned 7 years old. His birthday was in July. He graduated. He was 16. Just not quite ready to turn 17. They bumped him up 2 grades. A year and a half later, his brother, another story I may tell later, his brother had met a preacher who talked him into going to Cincinnati Bible Seminary. Uncle John came home at Christmas time, and a man named Bill Beadle, I met Bill once. Bill insisted he was not a farming preacher, didn't have enough education to be a farming preacher. He was preaching farmer at his insistence, Iowa farmer. And Bill asked Uncle John to preach the New Year's Eve service. John had had 1 semester at Cincinnati Bible Seminary. And Bill asked John to preach the New Year's Eve service. And John asked Daddy to go with him. John was 2 years older than Dad. So Dad went along. And they had some time at Bill's. Dad says sitting at Bill's kitchen table, and Dad thought science had disproved the Bible. There wasn't any reason to believe any of that. And Bill looked at this little genius sitting in front of him and says, Seth, what are you going to do with the resurrection? That night when Uncle John preached, Dad accepted the Lord. Next fall, went to Cincinnati Bible Seminary. I met a guy one time, told me he went to Cincinnati Bible Seminary determined to be valedictorian. He said, I spent 1 week in Greek class with your dad, and I was determined to be salutatorian. After Dad graduated, he was assistant to Professor R.C. Foster for several years until Dr. F.W. Strong asked him to come to Arkansas, help revive a little college that was dying. The results of that's Ozark Bible College now, or Ozark Christian College, they call it now. You know what convinced him? He said, I couldn't answer Bill Beadle when he said, what are you going to do with the resurrection? All of these pillars we've looked at will support Jesus' claims to be the Son of God. And that's what we'll look at next week. And then what he has to say about the rest of Scripture, because that's where we get any idea of inspiration. You see, the only way we can believe something like God is directing this guy to write a book is we have to believe somebody that we historically know is the Son of God. Otherwise, I'll write a book. Claim there are lots of people in the world today claim God gave them this. There's one horrible, I wouldn't even call it a translation, claims to be a translation of Scripture called the Passion Translation, where the guy who wrote it claims that God gave him that explanation. If you have one, burn it. There's that kind of thing around. We'll talk about that next week. I'm 2 minutes over, sorry about that. Thank you.